Imagine a nation where Catholics, Muslims, and Orthodox Christians built cities together, where Slavic tongues sang in harmony, and enemies from past wars became neighbors under one flag. That was Yugoslavia, a strange dream in the heart of Europe. A country like no other, and then it shattered. In this video we dive deep into the rise and fall of Yugoslavia, from Tito's promise of unity to the descent into genocide and civil war, from brotherhood to betrayal. How did a nation built on hope collapse into horror? Who lit the match? And could it happen again, somewhere else, someday soon? You're watching PHT Eternal Mysteries, where history doesn't just speak, it breathes. The Patchwork Federation. Yugoslavia. The very name carries different meanings depending on who speaks it. To some, it's just a word in an old history book, a failed experiment of unity. To others, it's a haunting memory of brothers turning on brothers, of towns burned and futures broken. But before it collapsed in blood and flame, Yugoslavia was something strange, and at times, even beautiful. A federation, a union, a patchwork of 6 republics: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Macedonia, and Serbia, stitched together after the Second World War, trying to move forward as one. But from the very beginning, this was not a natural marriage. It was more like forcing rivers to run in the same direction, each with its own current, its own story, its own pride. These republics had been shaped not just by geography, but by centuries of foreign rule. The scars of the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires were still fresh. In the north, Slovenia and Croatia had tasted Western Catholic influence, with Vienna and Rome whispering in their ears for generations. In the south, Bosnia, Macedonia, and Kosovo had long been under the sway of the Islamic East, where the Ottoman Crescent had left deep marks on culture and identity. Serbia, fiercely orthodox and proud, had stood like a mountain between these worlds, often at war with both. It was never one people, it was never one language, it was never one faith, and yet, after the Second World War, there was hope. The Nazis had been defeated, the old kingdoms and foreign lords were gone, and a man named Tito, grizzled, charismatic, utterly pragmatic, emerged as the architect of a new Yugoslavia. He promised not just reconstruction, but reinvention. Before Tito, the region had been known as the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, a royal union dominated by Serbs. It was formed in 1918 from the Kingdom of Serbia and the state of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs. This version of Yugoslavia lasted only until World War II shattered it into pieces. During the war, a puppet state of Croatia was established under the Nazis, sparking genocides, brutal partisan warfare, and memories that would never truly fade. After the Axis powers were expelled, a new version of the country emerged, the democratic federal Yugoslavia. But this too was transitional. In 1945, it became the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, a communist state, yet one with a unique identity. Here, under Tito's leadership, Yugoslavia walked a delicate line. 6 republics, 2 autonomous provinces, Kosovo and Vojvodina, within Serbia. Dozens of ethnic groups, hundreds of years of conflict. But Tito had a vision: brotherhood and unity. He believed that the future of the Balkans depended not on erasing differences, but embracing them. And for a while, it worked. But before we dive into that fragile harmony, we must understand the flaw at the heart of this federation: the borders. They weren't drawn according to ethnicity. Serbs didn't live only in Serbia. Croats didn't live only in Croatia. Muslims, later called Bosniaks, were spread throughout Bosnia, Serbia, and beyond. Albanians in Kosovo, Hungarians in Vojvodina, Roma everywhere. The borders weren't lines of peace. They were loaded guns waiting for someone to pull the trigger. In many ways, the very structure of Yugoslavia was like a ticking clock. The ethnic and religious tensions were buried but never gone. Old grudges simmered under the surface, and as long as there was a strong enough hand pressing down on the lid, the pressure could be contained. But how long could that hand hold? Imagine this: a child born in Sarajevo in 1950 would grow up under Tito's banner, pledging allegiance to a state where his neighbor might be Catholic, his teacher Muslim, and his grocer Orthodox. He would speak Serbo-Croatian, a language with 4 names and 1 tangled history. He might serve in the Yugoslav army with Croats and Montenegrins. He might fall in love with someone from a different republic entirely. And yet, on some level, he would always be reminded of who he really was. Ethnicity was whispered in homes, in old folk songs, in cemeteries. Identity was never erased, just delayed. This was the delicate dance of Yugoslavia. The outside world saw it as a miracle, a multi-ethnic socialist state that resisted the Soviet Union, refused to become a puppet of the West, and seemed for a time to be charting its own successful path. But inside, the cracks were already forming. Old suspicions between Serbs and Croats, who had fought on opposite sides in World War II, never fully healed. Albanians in Kosovo increasingly felt marginalized. Slovenes, wealthier and more westernized, resented paying taxes that subsidized the poorer southern regions. And many Serbs, despite being the largest ethnic group, felt they were giving up too much power to maintain the federation. Even the republic's flags, each with their own star, seemed to hint at separate destinies. Still, there was a sense of something, a shared memory of war, a belief in socialist rebuilding, a cautious optimism. And standing at the center of it all, like a general holding a map of mismatched pieces, was Tito. But Tito was not immortal. And the question that would define a generation was not whether Yugoslavia could survive, but whether it could survive without him. Tito, the glue that held it together. Josip Broz Tito. Tito was not just a man, he was a myth. To the people of Yugoslavia, he was a war hero, a builder of nations, a father figure who had seen the worst of humanity and still believed in unity. Born in 1892 to a Croatian father and Slovenian mother, Tito defied the very divisions that would later tear his country apart. His rise to power wasn't accidental. It was forged in the fires of war. During World War II, while the world's great powers battled across continents, Tito led the partisan resistance against both the Nazis and local fascist regimes. His forces weren't just warriors. They were a symbol of what Yugoslavia could be: united, defiant, and self-reliant. Under his command, the partisans liberated their homeland without direct Allied intervention, a feat almost unheard of in Europe. This made him a legend, both feared and admired. And from this myth, a new Yugoslavia was born. When the dust settled in 1945, Tito declared the foundation of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. But unlike other communist nations in Eastern Europe, he refused to bow to Stalin. In 1948, just 3 years after aligning with the Soviet bloc, Tito broke with Moscow in what became known as the Tito-Stalin split. It was bold, it was dangerous, and it was revolutionary. Yugoslavia would not be a puppet. Instead, it would walk its own path, non-aligned, independent, and proudly neutral. Under Tito, Yugoslavia helped found the non-aligned movement, joining forces with nations like India and Egypt to stand apart from the Cold War's binary struggle. This gave the country an outsized voice on the world stage, a rare autonomy between East and West. But Tito wasn't just winning applause abroad. At home, he was orchestrating an intricate performance of balance and control. His motto, Brotherhood and Unity, was more than propaganda. It was policy. Ethnic nationalism was outlawed. Flags of individual republics took a back seat to the red, blue, and white of Yugoslavia. Any attempt to stir ethnic sentiment was crushed with precision. In schools, children were taught not as Serbs or Croats or Slovenes, but as Yugoslavs. Military service was mandatory and mixed. Soldiers from Macedonia trained with Bosnians. Croats stood guard beside Montenegrins. Marriage across ethnic lines was encouraged, even romanticized. Census forms offered the option to identify simply as Yugoslav. Tito built an identity where there had never truly been one, and for a time, it worked. By the 1960s and 70s, Yugoslavia was seen as one of the most successful communist nations in the world. Its citizens could travel freely to the West, unlike their Eastern Bloc neighbors. The country saw booming tourism on the Adriatic coast, industrial growth in the north, agricultural expansion in the south. Skyscrapers rose in Belgrade. Film, art, and literature flourished. Western rock bands performed in Zagreb. There was color, life, movement, and most of all, stability. Foreign journalists who visited were often surprised by what they saw. A socialist nation without secret police lurking on every street corner. A country where capitalism coexisted with state planning. Tito had somehow created a hybrid system, neither Soviet-style command economy nor Western market capitalism, but something in between. Even the average citizen felt the difference. A Slovenian factory worker in 1975 could own a car, take his family on a seaside vacation, and still believe in the promise of socialism. A Serb engineer could send his children to university, read American novels, and drink Turkish coffee in a cafe beside a mosque. It seemed, for a fleeting moment, that Yugoslavia had done the impossible, turned a fractured land into a working federation. But beneath the surface, problems were already beginning to stir. The very thing that had allowed Tito to keep Yugoslavia together, his absolute authority, also meant that there was no real mechanism for dealing with disagreement. The federal system on paper granted autonomy to the 6 republics, but in practice, all power flowed through him. The Constitution had been rewritten to balance ethnic power, but it was a fragile compromise, constantly needing adjustment. And Tito was aging. By the late 1970s, his health was deteriorating. Rumors swirled. Who would succeed him? Could anyone hold this house of cards together? In 1974, sensing the coming end, Tito pushed through a new constitution, one that further decentralized power to the individual republics. It was a strange move for a man who had spent decades centralizing control. But perhaps Tito knew something no one else did, that without some degree of autonomy, the Federation would not survive his death. The new constitution gave each republic, and even the autonomous provinces of Kosovo and Vojvodina, more power over their internal affairs. It was an attempt to placate rising nationalist sentiments, especially in the wake of student protests in Kosovo in 1968, and growing resentment in Slovenia and Croatia over economic imbalance. But in trying to give everyone a voice, the Constitution gave everyone a veto. Decision-making slowed, bureaucracy ballooned, resentment deepened, and then, on May 4, 1980, the inevitable happened. Josip Broz Tito died. He was 87 years old. Across Yugoslavia, factories stopped, schools fell silent. Millions watched his funeral, one of the largest in history, with tears in their eyes. World leaders from both East and West came to pay their respects. It was not just the death of a man, it was the end of an era. And though the nation stood still in mourning, the clock that had long been ticking began to ring. Because for all his brilliance, Tito had left behind no clear successor, no charismatic leader to replace him, no unified military doctrine, no true national identity. Only the memory of his forceful presence and the political scaffolding of a country built on compromise. In the absence of a strong hand, old questions began to rise again. Who are we, really? What does it mean to be Yugoslav? Who gets to decide what this country becomes now? The answers would come in fire, cracks in the foundation. In the days after Tito's funeral, the silence felt heavier than mourning. It was the sound of a nation waiting for direction, for leadership, for something to hold on to. But there was no voice loud enough, no presence large enough to fill the void he had left behind. The collective presidency, established by the 1974 Constitution, was meant to prevent the rise of another strong man. It was a rotating panel of leaders from each republic and province, intended as a symbol of equality and cooperation. But in practice, it became a chorus of discordant voices, each pulling in a different direction. Without Tito's central authority, the differences between the republics weren't just exposed, they were amplified. Economically, Yugoslavia was already showing signs of strain before his death. But now, those cracks widened into chasms. The global oil crisis of 1973 had hit hard, but the real damage came afterward. To fuel growth and industrial expansion, Yugoslavia had borrowed heavily from Western creditors. By the early 1980s, the country was drowning in debt, over $20 billion, with rising interest payments and falling exports. Factories that once buzzed with promise now stood idle. Unemployment, especially in the southern republics like Kosovo, Macedonia, and Montenegro, soared. Inflation reached crippling levels. And while the people in Slovenia and Croatia still enjoyed relative prosperity, they began to ask why they should continue subsidizing the rest. This wasn't just about economics, it was about identity, about fairness, about the unspoken belief that some republics were working harder than others and getting less in return. In Slovenia, conversations turned quiet but pointed. Why should we send our money south when our schools need better funding? In Croatia, frustrations simmered beneath the surface. Are we still a nation, or just an ATM for Belgrade? Meanwhile, in Serbia, many felt that decentralization had gone too far. The 1974 Constitution, they believed, had weakened Serbia's control over its own territory, particularly in the autonomous provinces of Kosovo and Vojvodina. To many Serbs, this wasn't just a legal issue, it was an existential one. Kosovo, with its majority Albanian population, had always been a point of friction. But now, with growing autonomy, it began to drift even further from Belgrade's control. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, protests erupted in Kosovo. Students and activists demanded equal status for Albanians, more rights, more representation. Some even whispered about full republic status. To Serbs, this was unthinkable. Kosovo wasn't just a province, it was a symbol. The legendary site of the 1389 Battle of Kosovo, where Serbian Prince Lazar fell in a doomed struggle against the Ottoman Empire. It was the spiritual heartland of Serbian history, a land of monasteries and martyrs. To lose influence, there felt like losing a part of the national soul. The Albanian protests were met with police crackdowns and military deployments. Clashes turned violent. Tensions soared. The more Belgrade tried to assert control, the more the Albanians resisted. And amid this chaos, a new figure began to rise. Quietly at first, but with growing power. His name was Slobodan Milošević. At the time, he was just another functionary in the League of Communists of Serbia. A bureaucrat, a man who spoke softly and smiled carefully. But behind closed doors, he was listening to the fears of the Serbian people, to the frustrations of those who felt abandoned by the federal system, to the calls for strength, order, and pride. Milošević saw what others didn't dare acknowledge, that nationalism, once buried, was rising again. Across the Federation, the idea of Yugoslav identity was weakening. Census data showed fewer people identifying as simply Yugoslav and more embracing their ethnic roots. Serbian, Croat, Slovene, Bosniak, Macedonian, Albanian, Montenegrin. The names that Tito had tried to blend into one were returning, with fury. It didn't help that the cultural divide had never truly closed. Television stations broadcast in different languages. Newspapers reported with local bias. Schoolbooks told slightly different versions of the same wars. Even pop music was regionalized. What Tito had held together with myth and might was now unraveling. And the leadership, fractured and indecisive, couldn't stop it. In Slovenia and Croatia, the idea of independence, once unthinkable, began to creep into political discourse. Intellectuals wrote essays questioning the legitimacy of the federation. Artists created works that reasserted regional pride. Politicians spoke in careful but unmistakable tones. Perhaps it is time we consider what is best for our people. In Serbia, a different narrative was forming. One of betrayal, marginalization, and the need for unity. Not Yugoslav unity, but Serbian unity. Milošević understood this mood. He didn't need to shout, he just needed to nod. Meanwhile, the economic crisis worsened. The IMF imposed austerity measures. Wages stagnated. Pensions shrank. The black market grew. And everywhere, was the feeling that the future was slipping away. In the cafes of Belgrade, in the bars of Sarajevo, in the homes of Zagreb, people began to speak of the past with more certainty than the future. "Do you remember when Tito was alive?" they asked. "Do you remember when we had stability?" But memory couldn't save them now. The younger generation, born in the post-war boom, had grown up without hunger, without bombs, without knowing what it was like to kill a neighbor over a flag. But that generation was now jobless, restless, and surrounded by a system they no longer believed in. And nationalism is a powerful story to tell of people who feel abandoned. As the 1980s dragged on, the media in each republic began to turn more overtly nationalistic. Journalists no longer told the story of Yugoslavia. They told the story of Croatia, of Serbia, of Bosnia. Radio stations replayed old folk songs, war ballads, laments of ancient battles lost and empires fallen. History, long dormant, was waking up. The people were no longer asking how to fix the Federation. They were asking whether it was even worth saving. And in the distance, beneath the sound of protests and speeches and cracking economies, a new rhythm began to beat. Not of harmony, but of division. Because when the walls of a house start to split, it's not the silence that breaks it, it's the echo. The nationalist awakening. The man who would fan the embers of resentment into full-blown fire began not with a roar, but with a whisper. Slobodan Milošević, once an unremarkable apparatchik in the League of Communists, had discovered a dangerous truth. The idea of Yugoslavia was fading, but the idea of Serbia was not. And in that realization lay both his opportunity and the nation's undoing. It was 1987. Kosovo was once again on fire with protest. Ethnic Albanians, who made up the overwhelming majority of the province's population, were demanding more rights, equal status, protections, and even republic recognition. The Serb minority, on the other hand, cried out that they were being harassed, silenced, driven from their ancestral lands. Tensions flared. The central government, paralyzed, looked away. But Milošević didn't. In April of that year, he arrived in Kosovo to hear the complaints of Serbs who claimed they were being persecuted by the Albanian majority. The event was meant to be small, controlled, symbolic. But the crowd swelled. Riot police clashed with Serb demonstrators. Emotions boiled. And then, something happened. Stepping forward into the fray, Milošević took the microphone. "No one," he said, "should dare to beat you again." 7 words, that was all. But for many Serbs watching on national television, it was electric. This wasn't a party functionary anymore. This was a man speaking their language, a man who saw them. And just like that, the transformation began. Milošević wasn't interested in preserving the delicate balance Tito had left behind. He didn't believe in brotherhood and unity. He believed in consolidating power, and the fastest way to do that was through the raw fuel of ethnic grievance. The so-called Rallies of Truth began that same year, a series of mass gatherings across Serbia and its provinces, all orchestrated with careful planning and all drenched in nationalist rhetoric. Serbs, Milošević declared, were under attack, not just in Kosovo, but across the Federation. They had been silenced for too long, their lands, their culture, their dignity, taken. The message was simple and primal: Serbia must rise again. It worked. With every rally, his support grew. Television channels replayed his speeches. Crowds waved Serbian flags, something once considered subversive under Tito's regime. And Milošević, ever strategic, began removing his opponents. In 1988, after a massive rally in Vojvodina, Milošević supporters ousted the local leadership. Soon after, he turned to Montenegro, where another wave of orchestrated protests, known as the anti-bureaucratic revolution, swept away the existing government and installed his loyalists. Within a year, he had secured control over 3 of Yugoslavia's republics and provinces: Serbia, Vojvodina, Montenegro. Kosovo, too, would soon follow, though not through consent, but through the crushing of autonomy. This wasn't politics. This was conquest in slow motion. Meanwhile, in other parts of the Federation, alarm bells were ringing. To the Croats, Slovenes, and Bosniaks, Milošević's rise looked disturbingly familiar. Echoes of the 1940s, when ethnic nationalism tore Yugoslavia into factions and unleashed horrors, began to resurface. They watched the rallies on TV. They heard the chants: "We will never be beaten again. Serbia for the Serbs." It was not just rhetoric. It was a warning. In Kosovo, the situation became explosive. The province's autonomy had always been a thorn for Serbian nationalists, and Milošević moved quickly to reduce its powers. Universities were purged of Albanian professors. Albanian language media was suppressed. Mass firings, police raids. The message was clear: Kosovo belonged to Serbia. Albanians resisted, but their protests were met with tanks. Tens of thousands of ethnic Albanians poured into the streets, waving flags, chanting for rights, and, increasingly, for separation. But to the Serbian government, these were not peaceful protests. They were threats, insurrections, terrorism. And as Milošević consolidated power at home, he demanded loyalty from the army. That loyalty would be tested very soon. As the 1980s turned into the 1990s, the rest of Yugoslavia began to fracture politically. Slovenia and Croatia, the most economically developed republics, were growing impatient with the central government in Belgrade. The communist system was collapsing across Eastern Europe, and Yugoslavia could not escape the wave. In 1990, each republic held its own multi-party elections. The communists were swept out in almost all of them, replaced not by liberals, but by nationalists. In Croatia, Franjo Tuđman, a former general and historian, came to power on a platform of Croatian pride and independence. He spoke openly about the injustices Croats had suffered under communist rule. He promised to protect his people from Serbian domination. To ethnic Serbs in Croatia, this felt like déjà vu. Many remembered the Ustaše regime of World War II, a fascist Croatian state that had committed genocide against Serbs, Jews, and Roma. Tuđman's rhetoric, while not genocidal, reawakened old fears. Serbs in Croatia began to arm themselves. They declared a new self-proclaimed territory, Sao Krajina, an autonomous Serb enclave that rejected Tuđman's government. And they made one thing clear: if Croatia declared independence, they would not be part of it. In Belgrade, Milošević supported them. Quietly, at first, then more openly. The Yugoslav People's Army, once the symbol of a united federation, began to fracture along ethnic lines. Serbian officers took control. Soldiers from Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia began deserting. The army was no longer Yugoslavia's. It was Serbia's, and the balance was gone. What had once been a fragile peace was now a tinderbox, one that needed only a spark. In the town of Knin, the heart of Scio Krajina, that spark came in the form of a barricade. Ethnic Serbs blocked roads with logs, earning the event the name the Log Revolution. They rejected orders from Zagreb. They demanded to be joined with Serbia. Croatia responded by sending in helicopters filled with special forces to crush the rebellion. But the Yugoslav Air Force, now effectively controlled by Milošević, intervened. They warned the helicopters, turn back or be shot down. The helicopters retreated, but the message was loud and clear. The Yugoslav Federation was no longer just divided. It was at war with itself, and soon there would be no turning back. But this story isn't over yet, because after the declarations of independence came something far darker, a whirlwind of war, betrayal, and horror. In Part 2, we'll uncover how Bosnia became a modern-day hell, the longest siege in modern history, Sarajevo, and one of the worst genocides Europe has seen since World War II. Stay tuned for Part 2, coming soon.